Hello and welcome to Red Read. Today I am talking about The History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. This is a 750 page philosophy history book that spans from basically the pre-Socratics, from the rise of Greek civilization and the Milesian school, all the way down until pretty much the philosophy of Russell himself and his contemporaries, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. The book is divided into 4 sections. So the first one is ancient philosophy, then Catholic philosophy, modern philosophy. Sorry, so 3 books, but then within those books there are kind of a couple of subsections. In terms of my general overall impression of the book, on the one hand, I ate this book up. So after I read Don Quixote, I knew that I didn't really want to read any more books last year, because I wanted to just end on the amazing high that was Don Quixote, but I still had a couple of days or like a week left of the year, so I was just started kind of skimming through, reading a little bit of this, and very quickly I got sucked in and realized I was reading 50 pages every day, to the point where I just went through and binged this whole book in about 2 weeks. Russell's writing is so good, and he's got such a classic witty British humor in the way that he writes, that he can really talk about, he just sucks you in for everything, even for some of the more drudge sections of the book, when he has to talk about sort of Roman history, and also the history of the church and the papality, I think it's called, the Pope. Some of those sections can be a bit hard, but it's always Russell finds some way to make it work and to make it really entertaining. I don't think this is the best book for learning about philosophy, because it doesn't really happen in the first section with the ancient philosophy, but when he starts talking about, at least from Plato, Aristotle onwards, and then till the end of the book, you can probably get a little bit annoyed, because Russell doesn't kind of describe the philosophers just as is on paper. Pretty much every single section will contain Russell's own criticisms of the philosophies that you'll be reading, or criticisms from other philosophers that were related to them, which is good, because it does show that philosophy was actually a dialogue, and especially when the criticisms were from contemporaries, so like Plato and Aristotle kind of actively talking to each other, it can be a little bit annoying to hear. Well, there were just some times where I feel like I wanted to just get almost the unbiased, uninterrupted opinions of each philosopher first, and then have a dedicated section afterwards to talking about the criticisms. So that was a little bit annoying, and I would say that was so consistent throughout the book that the only way in which to make the book worthwhile is that if you change your frame of reference, it's not History of Western Philosophy that happens to be written by a dude named Bertrand Russell. This is Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy. You are essentially going through with him through the history and getting his perspective and his opinion on everything. If you resign yourself to that, and you kind of accept that, and you are in for the ride, the book is amazing. It is so good. And if you happen to agree with the thoughts of Russell, then even better. But yeah, I would say it's not the best place to learn the most impartial kind of perspective or view on philosophy. But then again, sort of like Russell says in the introduction, this is just what you're going to get when you're reading an abridgment. If you actually wanted to genuinely learn about all of the philosophers in isolation, then you just have to go and read all of their books like Russell did. But yeah, I have a lot of annotations, as you can see. I have some general thoughts, but then what I'm going to do is I'm going to skim through my annotations and just talk about, or just to show you what the experience of reading the book is like. Some general thoughts that I got. is that the four philosophers that I was glad Russell sort of hipped me to, and I do want to go and check out and actually buy their own books and read them, are Plotinus, Boethius, Francis Bacon, and Spinoza. From Book 3, Part 2, which is Rousseau to the present day, I kind of felt like that whole section was a write-off in that it was very simplified and it didn't really dig into every philosopher as much as I would hope, which is, fair enough, because again, the book can't be 1,500 to 2,000 pages long. But that was okay because I knew that we were getting kind of so contemporary that this is around in the same centuries that Russell himself was born, so, or at least the 19th and the 18th century. I cannot wait to get to the section where we talk about Bertrand Russell's opinions on Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And there were a couple of omissions from the book. The most noticeable one, even though I haven't read any of his works, I kind of knew that it was glaringly obvious that he completely omitted Heidegger from the book. And yeah, when I get to it, I want to talk about the very last chapter, which is the philosophy of logical analysis. Anyway, from here, let's just jump in. I've got, quite a number of extracts written up that I want to read and then talk about, so let's get started. I really like that the very first section is called The Rise of Greek Civilization, and he does talk about very early religions, sort of like the Orphic cult and the cult of Bacchus. He talks about here something that I liked. The religions of Egypt and Babylonia, like other ancient religions, were originally fertility cults. The earth was female, the sun male. The bull was usually regarded as the embodiment of male fertility, and bull gods were common. This kind of comes in a little bit later. It was just a fun perspective shift. He's now talking about the Arcadia and the inhabitants who worshipped Hermes and Pan, who says, and Bertrand now writes, Russell now writes, the goat was the symbol of fertility because the peasants were too poor to possess bulls. Something I really liked is that he points out that the Greek pantheon gods were the first gods that were basically just very powerful humans. And he says, such genuine religious feeling as is to be found in Homer is less concerned with the gods of Olympus than with more shadowy beings such as fate or necessity or destiny, to whom even Zeus is subject. The Homeric gods were the gods of a conquering aristocracy, not the useful fertility gods of all who actually tilled the soil. This is another kind of Russell aphorism or piece of advice that I like. This is in the section where he's talking about Heraclitus. Two things are to be remembered: that a man whose opinions and theories are worth studying may be presumed to have had some intelligence, but that no man is likely to have arrived at a complete and final truth on any subject whatever. When an intelligent man expresses a view which seems to us obviously absurd, we should not attempt to prove that it is somehow true, but we should try to understand how it ever came to seem true. For the pre-Socratics, a lot of their writing, a lot of what we know about them is through polemical writings from later, or is it? Yeah, it's polemical writing from later philosophers. But something very wisely that Russell points out is this. When one thinks of what would become of any modern philosopher if he were only known through the polemics of his rivals, one can see how admirable the pre-Socratics must have been, since even through the mist of malice spread by their enemies, they still appear great. Again, Russell just coming in, giving his own opinion. You can so tell that he, one of the big bones, a couple of the big bones that he has to pick with so much of ancient philosophy and even modern philosophy is one, how women and minorities are treated in a society, but also two, that starting from a kind of ideal that you have and then trying to figure out ways in which to justify it is, he thinks, very intellectually insincere. And so he says, one of the defects of all philosophers since Plato is that their inquiries into ethics proceed on the assumption that they already know the conclusions to be reached. We start part 2, which is book 1, part 2, which is Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And this is a section where probably is probably most frustrating to see Russell just jumping in and giving his own opinions, because he has no filter when it comes to just saying like, okay, Aristotle is one of the greatest minds who has ever lived, and it took basically 2,000 years for us to ever get any philosophers who are as smart as him. On the other hand, he also came at exactly a sort of time where he pretty much ruined philosophy because everybody needed to kind of go through and try to like justify their works in accordance with him, and that Aristotle would have been incredible if he were just a stepping stone onto something later as opposed to a dead end. And it's just like, on the one hand, these are the like probably the most commented on philosophers ever, and so it's understandable why Russell probably assumes that we already know some stuff about them, and so he's able to stretch and just give his own opinion a lot more than in others. But if it is the first time you're reading or learning about them, it's probably not the best place to do it, but it's hella entertaining. And something I just want to point out as well, maybe in a not being totally self-aware of his own writing and his own work, on page 90, he says, "It is the excellence of Plato as a writer of fiction that throws doubt on him as a historian. His Socrates is a consistent and extraordinarily interesting character, far beyond the power of most men to invent, but I think Plato could have invented him. Whether he did so is, of course, another question." He says that one of the things, and this is, I think, true, one of the things that makes Plato so good is that he is actually a really talented writer. And I thought, is that what's happening with Mr. Bertrand Russell as well? Because this is probably, again, not the best book, but Russell is so good at writing and so fun and entertaining that you just want to keep reading more. Something that really affected me and has made me think a lot, especially about Stoicism and about how popular modern Stoicism is. This is just Plato's opinions are sort of related to authoritarianism in politics. And one of the things he says is, Plato, in common with most Greek philosophers, took the view that leisure is essential to wisdom, which will therefore not be found among those who have to work for their living, but only among those who have independent means or who are relieved by the state from anxieties as to their subsistence. This point of view is essentially aristocratic. And the reason I got to thinking about it is just that I think it's important to realize that we do want to be kind of learned and cultured and look and find ancient wisdom, but we can't necessarily pick up a book from old times and just read it and think that we can instantly apply it to our everyday life, considering the fact that a lot of what these people are saying, like Aristotle and Plato explicitly said that you can't achieve what a philosopher needs to achieve if you have to work, and they use that to justify the existence of slaves and of a working class. So Russell also points out, I think very wisely, that Socrates for scientific people is as close to Jesus as you could possibly want. And he writes, "What the gospel account of the passion and the crucifixion was for Christians, the Phaedo was for pagan or free-thinking philosophers." And just that, the Phaedo presents Plato's ideal of a man who is both wise and good in the highest degree and who is totally without fear of death. Russell picking a bone with Aristotle, which I always love to hear after the end of summarizing. I don't always love to hear it because I do like some parts of Aristotle, but I love hearing some British sass, and we're going to get a whole lot more of that. You best be prepared. But he writes, after talking about the Nicomachean ethics, he says, "Even his account of friendship is tepid. He shows no sign of having had any of those experiences which make it difficult to preserve sanity. All the more profound aspects of the moral life are apparently unknown to him. He leaves out, one might say, the whole sphere of human experience with which religion is concerned." What he has to say is what will be useful to comfortable men of weak passions. He has nothing to say to those who are possessed by a god or devil, or whom outward misfortune drives to despair. For these reasons, in my judgment, his ethics, in spite of its fame, is lacking in intrinsic importance. This is a really great insight that I was glad I read because, there is a important concept or a theme of decentralization, especially because of how kind of big the governments have gotten. just in the modern post-industrial revolution. But Russell says, with regard to the size of states, Aristotle makes, on a different scale, the same mistake that is made by many modern liberals. A state must be able to defend itself in war, and even, if any liberal culture is to survive, to defend itself without very great difficulty. How large this requires a state to be depends upon the technique of war and industry. In Aristotle's day, the city-state was obsolete because it could not defend itself against Macedonia. In our day, Greece as a whole, including Macedonia, is obsolete in this sense, as has been recently proved, because he wrote that in 1941. He said, there can be no true independence except for a state or alliance strong enough by its own efforts to repel all attempts at foreign conquest. Nothing smaller than America and the British Empire combined will satisfy this requirement, and perhaps even this would be too small a unit. Point that I like, he talks about this in the section on cynics and skeptics. He says, Aristotle is the last Greek philosopher who faces the world cheerfully. After him, all have, in one form or another, a philosophy of retreat. And he's just talking about how, because of the kind of physical circumstances of like government and so on, it's just the sorts of philosophies that could emerge depending on where you live. Something I like that he points out regarding Stoicism is that quoting him, if virtue is the sole good, there can be no reason against cruelty and injustice, since, as the Stoics are never tired of pointing out, cruelty and injustice afford the sufferer the best opportunities for the exercise of a virtue. If the world is completely deterministic, natural laws will decide whether I shall be virtuous or not. If I am wicked, nature compels me to be wicked, and the freedom which virtue is supposed to give is not possible for me. Again, just pointing out that a personal philosophy could work for one person, for you, but it doesn't necessarily work if it's spread out amongst an entire group or community or civilization. And similarly, the Stoic is not virtuous in order to do good, but does good in order to be virtuous. Something I like, this has given me a little bit of Fraser Golden Bow vibes, I imagine, but also Joseph Campbell vibes. Elements of mystery religions, both Orphic and Asiatic, enter largely into Christian theology. In all of them, the central myth is that of the dying God who rises again. Originally, it was the Jewish nation that sinned, and that was collectively punished, but later sin became more personal, thus losing its political character. When the church was substituted for the Jewish nation, this change became essential, since the church, as a spiritual entity, could not sin, but the individual sinner could cease to be in communion with the church. And I think Russell is also wise to point out that when we say the Dark Ages, it's just the Western Dark Ages, and he says that it marks our undue concentration on Western Europe. In China, this period includes the time of the Tang Dynasty, the greatest age of Chinese poetry, and in many other ways, a most remarkable epoch. From India to Spain, the brilliant civilization of Islam flourished. What was lost to Christendom at this time was not lost to civilization, but quite the contrary. And this was something St. Anselm developed the ontological argument, which I will read, but I will just say that it never clicked for me what exactly it is going on in that argument, but because the syntax was just wigging me out. I'll read it first, and then I'll read what Russell says, and even though I know it's I still haven't got it, but it's helped out so much. The ontological argument is as follows. We define God as the greatest possible object of thought. Now, if an object of thought does not exist, another, exactly like it, which does exist, is greater. Therefore, the greatest of all objects of thought must exist, since, otherwise, another, still greater, would be possible. Therefore, God exists. And that makes no sense to me. I just do not see that, that literally sounds like a wrong sentence. But Russell said, he goes, Russell says that the argument has never been accepted by theologians, but it keeps popping up with, Thomas Aquinas and then other people, Descartes, Leibniz, Kant. It just seems to never go away. And what he says later on helps out so much, which is this. The real question is there anything we can think of which, by the mere fact that we can think of it, is shown to exist outside our thought? And, okay, there we go. Finally, at least something to hook on so that I can grab it and try to get my head around the ontological argument. Some Russell sass. He felt a duty to lepers for their sake, not for his. Unlike most Christian saints, he was more interested in the happiness of others than in his own salvation. And we are going to get some more, man. You buckle your seatbelts, because by the time I get to book 3, it is just pure, pure subjective polemical writing, and I was all for it. I loved this. This was such a great insight. He talks about the Renaissance and how we kind of think about it as like, oh yeah, this is the time when people started being smart and stopped thinking about delusions. But he says, the first effect of emancipation from the church was not to make men think rationally, but to open their minds to every sort of antique nonsense. And I liked that he pointed this out. Obviously, Russell is a mathematician, but he says that when he's talking about Newton, he says, the triumph of Newton was so complete that he was in danger of becoming another Aristotle and imposing an insuperable barrier to progress. In England, it was not till a century after his death that men freed themselves from his authority sufficiently to do important original work in the subjects of which he had treated. Kind of pointing out some of the flaws in romanticism, hero mentality, the stuff that obviously informed Nietzsche, and then would kind of go on to inform the Nazi Party. We cannot all have the career of heroic leaders and cannot all make our individual will prevail. This philosophy, like all other forms of anarchism, inevitably leads, when adopted, to a despotic government of the most successful hero. When this tyranny is established, he will suppress in others the self-assertive ethic by which he has risen to power. This whole theory of life, therefore, is self-refuting in the sense that its adoption in practice leads to the realization of something utterly different, a dictatorial state in which the individual is severely repressed. Cough, cough, people who preach being alpha males. This is something that still gets me as well, and maybe some later philosophers have gotten an answer to it. But Schopenhauer talks about how the saint's purpose is to come to non-existence, but Russell says we can't interpret it to mean that, because for some reason suicide is never justified. Like actually ceasing to live is not justified in that philosophy. And then get ready for a zinger. It's talking about Schopenhauer. It is difficult to believe that a man who was profoundly convinced of the virtue of asceticism and resignation would have never made any attempt to embody his convictions in his practice. All right, we've got some zingers against Nietzsche. Get ready for this. His opinion of women, like every man's, is an objectification of his own emotion towards them, which is obviously one of fear. Quote, forget not thy whip. And then... end quote. But 9 women out of 10 would get the whip away from him, and he knew it, so he kept away from women and soothed his wounded vanity with unkind remarks. Honestly, even though I agree with Russell, I cannot believe that the chapter that was on Nietzsche was the chapter that was on Nietzsche. I almost felt like there was going to be a fake out, and I would flip the page and it would be like, okay, now we're actually talking about Nietzsche's philosophies, but then it just ends and moves on. It's absolutely wild how much Russell hates Friedrich Nietzsche. And the last thing I will say is just that one of the things I do wish happened, and I don't know if Russell ever considered this, but considering how opinionated so much of the book is, the final chapter called The Philosophy of Logical Analysis, which is the philosophy of the school that Russell himself follows. If Russell wasn't a coward, he would have just called the final chapter Bertrand Russell. And that's all I wish I wanted to see. I hope you enjoyed reading through some of the extracts of Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy. Like I said, the book was far more entertaining than it was perhaps objectively useful, but it was still really entertaining, and I still got a lot of great extracts and insights from the world of philosophy and some authors that I'm keen to go on and read. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.